Hey, church family, welcome to conversation number 4. In this conversation, we're going to be asking the question, what is the New Testament? Take a moment and pause this video and discuss this question as a family if you like. If you're back with us, again, we're asking the question, what is the New Testament? Here's the answer that we're going to explore to this. The New Testament is the apostles' teachings in 27 books that reveals a new covenant through Jesus the Messiah and how it was lived out in the early church. Now, let's break that big answer down into different parts. Part 1, the New Testament is the apostles' teachings. When Jesus came to earth, he gathered many followers who were called disciples. And disciple just simply means a student. And of all these disciples, which there were many, he specifically chose 12 to be his apostles. And an apostle means someone you send out, like a delegate or an ambassador to go send your message out to someone else. And these apostles are the people who became the leaders of the church after Jesus went back to heaven. That's part 1. The New Testament is the apostles' teachings. Part 2, the New Testament is the apostles' teachings in 27 books. Just like the Old Testament that we talked about in the last conversation, the New Testament is made up of several smaller books all taken into one. And there are 27 books in the New Testament. There are the Gospels, the book of Acts, which is the book of history, many different letters, and then one book of prophecy that we call Revelation. And we'll dive deeper into those later on. But part 2, as we're talking about, there are 27 books in the New Testament. Now part 3, the New Testament is the apostles' teaching in 27 books, which reveals a new covenant. Remember, a covenant, also known as a testament, is a sacred promise. God had made a covenant originally with the ancient nation of Israel, ending with that covenant being broken. But in the Old Testament, God promised that he would make a new covenant. He says in Jeremiah chapter 31, "This is the covenant I will make. I will be their God, and they will be my people. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more." For all those who enter into this new and improved covenant, God promised he would forgive all their sins completely. And now we are able to enter into that new covenant through the person of Jesus Christ. And that's part 4. Part 4 says the New Testament is the apostles' teaching in 27 books, which reveals a new covenant through Jesus the Messiah. Do you know how Jesus is sometimes called Messiah and sometimes called Christ? Well, why is that? Well, the words Christ and Messiah are actually, they mean the same thing. In English, both words basically would mean anointed one. Messiah is a word in Hebrew, which was the language of the Old Testament, and Christ is a word from the Greek, which was the language of the New Testament. Messiah, Hebrew for anointed one, and Christ, Greek for anointed one, mean the same thing. So why is Jesus called the anointed one? Whether we say it in the Hebrew word or the Greek word, why is he called the anointed one? Think back to the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, there were 3 types of people who were anointed, often with oil symbolically, to perform a special mission for God. In the Old Testament, the 3 groups that we see often anointed are prophets, priests, and kings. Here's what's awesome. Jesus was all 3 of these. He was a prophet, a priest, and a king. And that's why he is the ultimate anointed one. He is the ultimate embodied, fulfilled priest, prophet, and king. And the Old Testament had predicted that a special Messiah, the anointed one, would come in the future and save his people from their biggest enemies. That person was Jesus Christ. That's part 4. Part 5, the New Testament is the apostles' teaching in 27 books, which reveals a new covenant through Jesus the Messiah and how it was lived out in the early church. After the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, cover the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the next book in the New Testament, called Acts, tells the story of the early church. Acts tells about how the church started in Jerusalem and then grew all over the Mediterranean world. And most of the books in the New Testament, from Romans to the book of Jude, are letters. These letters were written to help churches and individuals that were going through tough and confusing times, often facing persecution. They are also helpful to us when we go through our own challenging times in our lives today. So as we take this all in, how would you now answer the question, what is the New Testament? Here's the answer. The New Testament is the apostles' teaching in 27 books that reveals a new covenant through Jesus the Messiah and how it was lived out in the early church. Now, as a family, walk through the Continuing the Conversation handout and join with us this week as we take time to reflect on the truth of who God is and just what the New Testament is and what it means for us. Thank you, and I'll see you next week in the next conversation.